There's a place on every homestead where food stays cool in summer. Frozen winters cannot touch it, and the power grid is completely irrelevant. It is called underground food storage, and most homesteaders are only using a fraction of what this ancient system can actually do. Your ancestors fed entire families through brutal winters with nothing but soil and clever thinking. So why do so few people today know how deep to dig, what to line the walls with, or which foods actually survive down there? That answer changes everything. Most people picture underground food storage as a dark hole in the ground with a wooden door slapped on top. And if that is the image you have, it explains why so many homesteaders build one, use it wrong, and give up on it inside a season. The vegetables rot, the meat spoils, and the whole project gets written off as something that only worked before refrigerators came along. But that is not a failure of the concept. That is a failure of the build. Because underground food storage is not one system, it is actually several very different systems, each designed for a different class of food, and each working by a completely different physical principle. Get the wrong system for the wrong food, and nothing survives. Get it right, and you have a working pantry that runs on nothing but the earth itself. Here is what this video is really about: the specific decisions, in the right order, that determine whether your underground storage works or fails. Not the broad idea, the actual steps, the actual depths, the actual materials, and the actual reasons behind each one. So start with the first decision, because everything else flows from it. You need to choose what you are actually storing, because that choice determines which structure you build. There are two fundamentally different underground storage systems, and they are not interchangeable. The first is the root cellar, which is designed to keep living dormant vegetables in a state of suspended animation. The second is the cold storage larder, which is designed to keep animal products, dairy, and preserved foods below the spoilage line of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The root cellar works by holding produce in the stable thermal band of the earth, which in temperate climates sits right around 32 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 8 to 10 feet. The cold larder needs to go colder and stay colder, and it usually relies on a combination of depth, insulation, and sometimes ice to hold that temperature. If you mix these two functions in one undivided space, you will lose most of what you store, because the conditions that keep carrots alive actively damage dairy and vice versa. So decide first, then build. If your primary goal is root vegetables, apples, and cabbages, you're building a root cellar. If your primary goal is butter, cheese, cured meats, and preserved eggs, you are building a cold larder. If you want both, you build both, or you divide a single larger structure into two climate-controlled zones. Now the root cellar, since that is where most homesteaders start. The single most important variable is depth, and most people do not go deep enough. Frost line depth is the engineering number that drives this decision, and it varies significantly by zone. In USDA Hardiness Zone 3, the frost line sits at roughly 60 inches, which is 5 feet of frozen ground above your floor if you are not deep enough. Zone 4 runs around 48 to 52 inches, Zone 5 around 40 inches, Zone 6 around 24 to 30 inches, and Zone 7 around 12 to 18 inches. 8 feet from the finished floor to the surface above is your minimum in a temperate climate, because at that depth you are comfortably below the frost line in Zones 5 through 7. If you are in Zone 3 or Zone 4, push to 10 feet. Because the ground above you freezes hard in winter, and that freeze front can creep downward faster than people expect. At 8 to 10 feet of depth, the surrounding soil acts like a thermal flywheel, absorbing summer heat slowly and releasing it slowly through winter, which means the interior temperature barely moves regardless of what is happening above ground. Walls are the next decision. And here are the choices between poured concrete, concrete block, stone, treated timber, or earth bag construction. Poured concrete is the most airtight and the easiest to keep clean, which matters for long storage. Stone is the most traditional and works beautifully if the gaps are properly mortared. Earth bag construction uses polypropylene bags filled with tamped soil or gravel stacked in offset courses, and it is worth knowing because it requires no forms, no mixing, and no heavy equipment. Just bags, fill material, and 2 strands of barbed wire between each course to lock the stack. Timber works, but it requires a vapor barrier on the soil-facing side before backfill, or it will rot within a decade. Specify 6 mil polyethylene sheeting for that vapor barrier applied directly against the timber before you push any soil back against the wall. In humid climates, also line the interior ceiling side with 6 mil polyethylene sheeting, because without it, warm, moist air condenses on the cold ceiling and drips directly onto stored produce. Whatever you build the walls from, the floor should be dirt or fine gravel, never concrete. The reason is humidity management in food storage, because root vegetables need 85 to 95% relative humidity to stay firm and edible. And a bare earth or gravel floor wicks just enough moisture into the air to maintain that range naturally. A concrete floor seals that moisture exchange off, and your vegetables will slowly desiccate and shrivel, even at the right temperature. So how do you actually hit and hold that 85 to 95% target once the cellar is sealed and stocked? A digital hygrometer mounted at mid-shelf height gives you a real reading rather than a guess, and you should check it every time you open the door in the first few weeks of operation. If humidity is running low, hang a piece of wet burlap from a ceiling hook near the center of the space and re-wet it every few days. If you need more sustained output, set a wide gravel tray on the floor with 2 inches of standing water in it. The gravel keeps the water surface exposed and the evaporation rate steady without waterlogging the floor area around it. If humidity is running too high and mold is appearing on walls or shelves, mums open both vents slightly wider on cool nights to pull drier outside air through. Ventilation is where most homesteaders make their critical mistake, and it is a simple one. You need 2 vents, not one. One vent sits low on the north or shaded wall and pulls cool outside air and near the floor. The second vent sits high on the opposite wall and lets the warmer displaced air exit near the ceiling. This creates a gentle convective loop that does 3 things. It flushes ethylene gas that ripening produce constantly releases, it prevents humidity from tipping into the wet, soggy range that breeds mold, and it lets you regulate temperature on cool autumn nights by opening both vents wide to pre-cool the space before the main harvest goes in. Without that 2-vent loop, you get a stagnant pocket of warm, moist air sitting on top of your food, and that is a mold factory. The door should face north if at all possible, open outward and be thick enough to act as insulation, not just a barrier. A double-door airlock, which is simply 2 doors with a small buffer space between them, is worth building if you live somewhere with genuinely brutal winters, because every time you open a single door in January, you lose a significant portion of the stable cold air you have been accumulating. Now the shelving, because the layout inside determines what you can actually store and how long it stays good. Build shelves along the walls at multiple heights. Keep the lowest shelf at least 6 inches off the floor to allow air to move underneath bins and crates. Store apples and pears away from root vegetables because they release ethylene gas heavily and will accelerate sprouting and wilting in carrots, even with your vents running. If you can, store apples in a slatted wooden crate or open box so air circulates around each fruit rather than letting them press together and share any rot that develops. Potato storage deserves its own attention because getting it wrong is one of the most common and expensive mistakes in a root cellar. Potatoes go in the darkest corner because light triggers solanine production, which is the compound that turns potato flesh green and mildly toxic. The specific temperature sweet spot for potato storage is 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold enough to shut down sprouting but warm enough to prevent the starches from converting to sugar, which makes them taste wrong in the pan. If your cellar runs colder than 38 degrees in deep winter, move the potato bins to a slightly higher shelf where the temperature is marginally warmer. Onions and garlic need the driest air in the space, so hang them in mesh bags or on racks near the upper vent where the air is moving and slightly drier. Squash and pumpkins prefer slightly warmer and drier conditions than the rest of the root cellar, around 50 to 55 degrees and 60 to 70% humidity. So if you have a natural warm spot near the door or near the upper section of the structure, that is where your winter squash goes. Now the cold larder, which operates on a different logic entirely, where the root cellar uses earth thermal mass to hold a stable mid-range temperature. The cold larder is trying to stay consistently below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the point below which bacterial growth in animal products slows to a safe crawl. The way to hit that number reliably without electricity is to combine depth with insulation, and in colder climates, with a modest ice reserve. A simple cold larder that works well is a secondary chamber built off one corner of your root cellar, separated by an insulated partition wall, with its own door and its own small vent, positioned to pull the coldest possible outside air directly in during winter nights. Cured meat storage is one of the highest value uses for a cold larder, and it has specific requirements that are different from dairy. Cured hams and sausages need a chamber temperature of 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of 65 to 75%, which is distinctly drier than the 85 to 95% range you maintain for root vegetables. If your cold larder is running too moist for cured meat, a small mesh rack hung near the upper vent with good airflow around each piece will help surface moisture evaporate without drying the product all the way through. In that same chamber, you store a small cache of packed ice in an insulated bin, and that ice acts as a thermal battery, holding the chamber temperature below 40 degrees through the warmer months as it slowly melts. So, where does that ice actually come from if you are working off grid? Ice harvesting is the answer, and there are three practical sources. Winter pond cutting is the oldest method, where you saw blocks from a frozen pond in late January or early February when ice thickness reaches at least 8 inches. If you do not have a pond, block freezing in metal molds works well on any dry January night when temperatures drop into the single digits. Simply fill galvanized or steel molds with clean water, set them outside, and retrieve solid blocks in the morning. Dry January nights, meaning nights with low humidity and hard freezes, produce the clearest and densest ice, which melts more slowly than cloudy ice full of trapped air. The key to making harvested ice last is keeping it packed in clean straw or dry coarse sawdust with at least 4 inches of packing material on every face of the block, and making sure any meltwater drains away immediately through a small drain channel built into the floor. Meltwater sitting in contact with your remaining ice pulls heat into the block from below and dramatically shortens how long it lasts. A well-insulated cold larder with a 50 to 60-pound ice reserve, properly packed, will hold below 40 degrees from April through into July in most temperate climates. That covers the gap between the last hard frost and the point in summer when your root cellar alone is cold enough to handle dairy safely. Now the practical build sequence, starting from the ground up. Pick your site first, and pick the north-facing slope of any rise in your land if you have one, because the hill above shades the structure year-round and provides a natural berm of insulating earth on 3 sides. That specific configuration is called a hillside root cellar, and it is worth searching under that exact name if you are planning this build. A hillside root cellar uses the natural grade of the land to berm 3 walls automatically, which means you are only excavating the front face and the floor, not hauling fill material back in after the build. That alone saves a significant amount of labor compared to a fully buried structure dug into flat ground. Dig to depth, 8 feet minimum interior height in zones 5 through 7, 10 feet in zones 3 and 4. Build your walls, dirt floor, and frame your ceiling with enough overhead clearance to work comfortably inside, then pack at least 12 inches of earth over the roof for insulation. Install your vapor barrier on all soil-facing wall surfaces and on the interior ceiling before closing anything up, because retrofitting it later means tearing the structure apart. Install your 2-vent system before you close the ceiling, because adding it afterward is a major reconstruction. Build your door facing north. Insulate it thoroughly and add a simple wooden threshold seal at the bottom. Then divide the interior if you want both root storage and cold larder function. Or run the full space as a root cellar and add the cold larder as a separate smaller structure later. Stock it correctly. Keep the floor damp by sprinkling water on the dirt or gravel during dry spells. Confirm your humidity with a digital hygrometer and check the space weekly because one soft apple or one leaking crate of carrots can spread rot through an entire bin inside 4 days. So why does underground food storage outlast every other off-grid preservation method? Because it requires no ongoing input once it is built correctly. No fuel, no batteries, no maintenance, beyond keeping it clean and stocked. The earth does the thermal work, the two vents do the air management, the layout does the separation, and the frost line depth below your floor does everything else. Your ancestors understood that the ground under their feet was already doing most of the work, and the structure was just a way of stepping inside that process. That is the insight that makes everything click. You are not fighting the environment to keep food cold, you are building a room inside the part of the environment that is already cold. Get that right, and your underground food storage runs for decades without asking you for anything.